all of you know that we live in an era of globalization. More and more universities are exchanging students, and many engineers are trying to get a job in foreign countries. This requires quality assurance and high-level education. However, with the rapid development of technologies and appearance of new technologies such as convergence technology, accreditation of engineering education may differ according to the field of technologies as well as the region or countries where the engineering education is being held. Therefore, it is necessary to review and update accreditation process continuously. In this session, we would like to focus on the following three items. First, how to foster good engineers who are suitable for knowledge-based, digitalized, and globalized society of the 21st century. Two, how to educate them so that they will be recognized globally. Three, how to develop a system that guarantees to implement the two items. Three distinguished speakers will present their views. Each speaker will speak 25 minutes, and questions from the floor will be entertained after all speakers finish their presentation. Now, the order of presentation are a little bit different from what's distributed. First, Mr. Peter Williams, Chief Executive of QAA, which is Quality Assurance Agency of Higher Education of United Kingdom, will talk about the developing world of quality assurance. Then, Dr. George Peterson, he's Executive Director of APET, everybody knows, I think, Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology of the United States of America. He will be talking about international recognition of engineering graduates, namely the Washington Accord. Then, finally but not least, the Professor Woo Young of Korea University, and he is Chairman of International Activity of ABEAC, as I said, Accreditation Board for Engineering Education of Korea. He will talk about accreditation activities in Korea. Since the biographies are in your manual, I'm not going to repeat them because they need more time to speak rather than my introduction. So the first speaker, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and first of all may I express my gratitude to the organisers of this forum for inviting me to speak to you. I am not going to be using PowerPoint. I think you will have more PowerPoint later on, and we've had some very interesting PowerPoint sessions this afternoon, but I'm just going to talk to you about some of the challenges that I see facing the whole area of recognition, quality assurance, accreditation in a global context. And I do so not only wearing my hat as the Chief Executive of the Quality Assurance Agency in the United Kingdom, but also as the President of the European Association of Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education, a body which has around about 35 full members in the European higher education area, the area that is linked to the so-called Bologna process. And my comments come today not with the authority of well-worked-out answers to some of these questions, but to raise questions and to discuss possibilities associated with them. Now, the expansion of higher education worldwide is a phenomenon of which we are all well aware. In the last 50 years or so, it has moved from being the preserve of a small elite minority to becoming a reasonable expectation of an increasingly large proportion of the population of developed and developing countries. The purpose of higher education has also changed, where once it offered an exclusive opportunity for the intellectually most able and active to develop and hone, sharpen their rarefied scholarly capacities, it is now responding, like any other service industry, to the wider needs, expectations and demands of society. Higher education is, in consequence, viewed all across the world as the route to many desirable outcomes: better jobs, more responsive and competitive economies, accelerated social development and greater personal prestige. So higher education isn't what it was. In the last 50 years, it has turned into something quite different. Hand in hand with these profound and fundamental changes in higher education has emerged another phenomenon: quality assurance. Everywhere, governments are demanding that quality assurance systems and agencies be set up or are setting them up themselves. The international network of quality assurance agencies in higher education, sometimes called INQUAHE, now has more than 180 members in one or other of its membership categories. Quality assurance and its handmaiden, accreditation, are often seen as a solution to all higher education's problems. Quality assurance, it is believed, will protect consumers, improve productivity, weed out the ineffective providers, and produce better quality, thereby guaranteeing that higher education delivers what society is demanding of it. Despite its ubiquity, the fact that it's everywhere, though, and the breadth of expectations associated with it, quality assurance is a phrase which has no commonly shared meaning. The words are used in different ways, in different languages, and in different countries. They encompass a huge range of activities, processes and procedures undertaken for different reasons by different actors and using different methods. I have sometimes used a PowerPoint slide which shows some of the different purposes and expectations of quality assurance in higher education, and it runs to 2 pages. So we're talking about a concept which can have so many different meanings and uses and purposes and procedures that it is very hard to consider it as a single activity or concept. At its simplest, it is possible to identify, I think, 5 principal purposes for quality assurance in higher education. Verification of the standards of qualifications, allocation of resources, provision of information, the improvement and enhancement of teaching and learning, and accountability for the use of what are usually or frequently public funds. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive purposes, and many external quality assurance agencies try to combine them. Similarly, the methods used to achieve these purposes are many and varied. In general, however, the majority of national quality assurance and accreditation agencies, and I stress again at the moment that I'm talking about national agencies around the world, have focused their work at the level of individual programs of study and individual degree courses, and have used procedures that concentrate essentially on the inspection and approval of these, using accreditation mechanisms which are in essence pass-fail examinations. You either become accredited or you don't, judged against formal input process criteria. That has been, I think, the tradition of national accreditation models. These are frequently quantitative in nature and consist of counting proxies for quality that are assumed to be indicators of teaching quality, such as the number of books in the library or the number of PhDs amongst the academic faculty. And it's sometimes for me hard to understand the underlying and unstated purpose of some of these activities, or why it is thought they provide useful or usable information about the quality of teaching, or more importantly, the quality of students' learning. And it's fair to say that, having made that statement, I should also say that in a number of countries, things are moving on, and the rather limited and narrow concept of quality in higher education is being developed in a way which I think is altogether both healthy and encouraging. I mentioned the difficulty of defining quality assurance in higher education. That is, in fact, easier to define than the concept of quality in higher education, which is a very elusive term indeed. The program accreditation approach has, though, proved very popular, and that's for a number of reasons. First, its focus is on programs, which is what students and employers are interested in. If you're a student, you want to know about, well, you're intending to be a student, you want to know what it is you're letting yourself in for, you want to know about the quality of the course that you're actually doing. Secondly, inspection carries with it an authoritative status, and it's generally unambiguous. You either pass or fail. There's no grey area, or rarely is there a grey area between. And inspectors are, by their very nature and their very authority, right in their judgments, even when they're wrong, because they have been given the authority to make those judgments. Thirdly, program inspection, inspecting the actual program itself, bypasses institutional, university responsibilities in some cases, and centralises formal control over programs in the hands of the inspectorate and or its masters. That is to say, for most national systems, accreditation is a way of maintaining government control, either directly or indirectly, over what's going on in the universities. And finally, if the outcomes of the accreditations are published, they can lead, and if there's any more information than simply pass-fail, they can make it easy to create rankings. But I think program-based accreditations and similar methods do have some limitations. If they are simply grounded in compliance against explicit criteria, they can encourage inertia and stifle innovation. And that, I think, is one of the criticisms which is most prevalent, is that we only have to reach the standard of the accreditation and do no more. And if that minimum standard is not very high, it doesn't encourage improvement. And there can be sometimes little incentive for institutions to do more than meet those criteria. And it also can encourage gameplay. That is to say, people will make sure they do what they need to get the pass status to get accredited, but then they go and make sure that in order to do that, they put themselves in the best light for the short time during which the accreditors are present. And sometimes they can be very expensive and burdensome. The cost in time and money for both institutions and agencies of preparing for and undergoing program reviews or accreditation activities is invariably high. And the opportunity cost can rapidly become unjustifiable. And that's particularly true in a situation where the university may find themselves with 25 or 30 or 40 accrediting bodies to deal with, to cover the whole of their range of work. Program reviews and accreditations tend to look at historical data, the past rather than the future, and their validity as a result can be quickly out of date. Large countries can find themselves with the need to evaluate and accredit many thousands of programs. This is an accreditation to authorise the program being run or for public recognition of them. And that diverts huge resources. And then they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again at 5, 6, 10-year intervals. And I think this is one of the problems that's being faced at the moment in countries such as Germany, which are undertaking a comprehensive accreditation of their programs, their bachelor's and master's programs, which they are introducing as part of the Bologna process. They all have to be accredited. And this is causing great difficulties to the country because of the cost and the time and the fact that it's locking up a large number of people in accreditation activities. And in my own country, the United Kingdom, this occurred in the 1990s. We tried this in the 1990s. And they showed that once institutions learned how to beat the system, how to become efficient at passing the test, then any value it might have had as a tool for development and developmental and improvement opportunities, they declined dramatically. The main alternative approach to program-level accreditation treats the whole institution to external scrutiny, not just one program, or instead of programs. And these use procedures such as academic audit or institution evaluation. And this approach also has its supporters. Although at the moment they are in smaller numbers than those who favour the program-level approach. This way of assuring quality takes as its starting point the principle that only those who are actually responsible for providing higher education, that is the teachers and the organisations, the institutions that they're working in, it's only those with that responsibility can actually ensure that quality is acceptable, good, or whatever level they wish to set it at. So the principle of this is that responsibility lies with the institution as part of its corporate responsibility for its own work. It is therefore the responsibility of institutions to assure the quality of their own programs, not an external agency. External institutional reviews or audits are also more concerned with how effectively that responsibility is being discharged than with checking that externally determined detailed requirements are being complied with. The theoretical justification for this approach lies in the assumption that a well-functioning, autonomous institution will want to take good care of its teaching and learning in order to establish or retain its reputation, and will be eager to innovate and compete with its peer providers. Such, at any rate, seems to be the view taken by an increasing number of countries in Europe that are participating in the Bologna process. We're beginning to see there a move, as I said in the case of Germany, beginning to see a wish to move from this very intensive program-level accreditation model towards an institutional approach which is both simpler, easier, and focuses on institutional responsibility rather than departmental responsibility. And it chimes in with a comment made this morning by Professor Singh about the additional freedoms that have been given to the National University of Singapore to allow the university to approve its own courses. That is, of course, the essence of the approach, which is manifested through the institutional review arrangements, systems. Now, while there are benefits, I think, in the whole institution approach, there are also limitations. Any move away from the external accreditation and review of individual programs reduces the opportunities for the independent verification of quality. Since whole institutional evaluations generally rely instead on there being internal institutional review procedures to provide information and judgments about programs. Now, these proxy measures depend for their public acceptability on a high level of maturity within the institutions, which in turn requires a sophisticated quality culture, an important phrase again in the European Bologna context, to be well embedded across all aspects of institutional life. It's without a full commitment to professionalism in the development and organisation of programs and in the establishment of a standard level of the achievement of students, then it's very difficult to envisage whole institutional reviews. Few countries anywhere in the world have such a deeply ingrained professional quality culture in relation to their teaching function, although it is much more prevalent in respect of research methods. But those that do have it have usually acquired it over many decades, if not longer, so there may be a time element in development of the maturity of institutions which will allow them to take on responsibility fully for the improvement of their own programs and for the internal reliance on the internal quality culture and quality assurance systems. Now, these observations suggest that after 20 or so years of its existence, quality assurance in higher education may have reached a crossroads. There seem to be two roads forward. One road will see a natural evolution from program and course-based inspections and accreditation towards whole institutional approaches, reflecting the developing maturity of institutions, their increasingly effective autonomy, and the need to be innovative and competitive. Now, the purpose of this sort of approach will be first to provide reassurance to governments and their public that their autonomy is being properly used. Secondly, to encourage and promote a developmental attitude to quality assurance. So it's not about inspection, it's not about verification so much, it's about offering commentaries on how well an institution is doing and how it can improve. Where the enhancement and improvement of both teaching and learning are seen as more important than checking compliance. That's one possible road forward. The other road will see it as more important to keep a firm central control over what is permitted to be offered in the name of a nation's higher education, public or private, and will be able to provide clear and explicit information about the relatively uniform and possibly more limited range of opportunities available to students. So compliance will continue for those countries to be more important than developmental autonomy for their institutions. In many ways, the program accreditation road is the more attractive option for the world of transnational, international higher education. And that's a separate case, an increasingly important case. What I've talked about so far mainly has been about national arrangements within countries. But when it comes to programs and institutions crossing borders, and we heard this morning about a number of these associated with universities in Asia in particular, but also elsewhere in Europe and North America, then information and reliability become particularly important. Degree programs are complex and confusing constructions, and the availability of reliable and simple to understand information about what is taught, how well it is taught, and the level of achievement needed to obtain a degree is important. The comparisons among the offerings of different institutions in different countries are easy to get wrong. And the dangerous misinformation that can result from superficial rankings based on poor information is a powerful reason to ask for better and more reliable indicators of quality. Now, having admitted the strength of the argument in favour of programme-level external quality assurance, I have to come clean and say that I have no doubt that in the longer term, the institutional approach offers the better chance for quality assurance to become a force for real change and improvement. And that, for the reasons I have already given, it is likely to become the method of choice in developed higher education systems. When done well, I stress when it's done well, it can be easily done badly, it is more economical, less burdensome, and forces institutions to take their responsibilities more seriously. It also provides greater opportunities for improvement and enhancement. If it does all these things, it will at the same time provide the necessary guarantees of standards and quality. So we have a conundrum, where both approaches, programme and institutional based, have their advantages and disadvantages, that do not on their own meet all the expectations that are perhaps unreasonably borne by the words quality assurance. And at the same time, the use of both approaches, I think, is probably unsustainably expensive. Whatever the answer, it must lie in a more sophisticated analysis and understanding of the real nature of quality and the assurance that most commentators offer at present. A true insight into the strengths and limitations based on global experience of what quality assurance can and cannot do, and the impact it has on national and international academic communities and their activities. Now, I hesitate to try and offer a solution to this conundrum, this dilemma, because it is easy to point out the shortcomings and weaknesses of any such attempt. But if we keep clear before us the needs that quality assurance is trying to meet, and recognise that these are many and may require several solutions, not just one, we may be able to come up with at least a strategy for quality assurance which may be acceptable internationally in the next decades. This would involve the acknowledgement that the two fundamental purposes of quality assurance are different and require different responses. On the one hand, it would be for national authorities to use quality assurance as a way of strengthening universities and improving their performance, assuring their basic capacity and effectiveness, while at the same time ensuring that the public interest in the reliable management of national qualifications is guaranteed. This approach would typically be at the whole institutional level once the system and the universities are judged to be mature enough to sustain it. Prior to that judgment, the cycle of developmental subject assessments would be the normal approach to help the development of the institutions. On the other hand, a complementary approach, meeting the needs of students to be sure that their individual programs, I say students and indeed employers, were acceptable internationally, would be met by specialist international accreditation or review organisations, operating in those subject areas where international recognition is of major importance. And I think George will be telling us more about just such a system in a minute. These would include, for example, engineering, business studies, management, computing, banking, accountancy, and other subjects which lead directly to the global employment market. It would generally not be necessary for the more traditional academic subjects, especially those in the humanities and social sciences, to be subject to this international accreditation procedure, but it might in some cases. A binary approach to quality assurance of this sort would, of course, create its own tensions and would do little to reduce the total burden, total weight of external scrutiny faced by universities. Under such a scheme, the national institutional scrutiny process would be compulsory, but the specialist subject accreditation would be voluntary, and institutions would presumably not seek it unless they perceived some clear benefit for themselves or their graduates in doing so. Through this means, the public and private interests of both society and individuals would be met. But whichever way the future of quality assurance develops internationally, it will be of prime importance that the purposes of the exercise are clear, that the procedures and processes adopted are fit for those purposes, and that every effort is made to ensure clear and meaningful publication of both purpose, processes and outcomes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a challenge which is only now being recognised. Thank you very much.
Professor Park, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, and I feel that I have to get on with it unless you ring a bell with me, so I'll be kind. I have a couple of statements to make before I get started. I'd like to go to the end of my presentation and tell you what I intend to say, and therefore if you get tripped up along the way, you'll know where I want to take you. So what I want to say up front is that here's the takeaway from my presentation. In listening to the presentations over the past few days, I made a certain observation that to realize the vision of global prosperity, global talent, it is important to be represented in the global community of organizations concerned with quality, stimulating innovation, and promoting creativity and technological education. And finally, The other observation I make is that globalization will succeed only to the extent of the well-developed mutual recognition agreements. So if we have strong mutual recognition agreements, I think that is a necessary condition for globalization, perhaps not sufficient, but we'll move on with that. What I want to talk about is the Washington Accord. And I was very interested last evening when I made mention of the Washington Accord, and there were people after the reception said, what is it and what's it good for? And I hope maybe that during this presentation that I can talk about what it's good for. I'm going to answer a couple of questions, and then I'm going to use a civil engineering analogy to try to make my point. And the question that I pose to you is, how do we develop a shared understanding of the quality of engineers, engineering technologists, engineering technicians who enter practice in the globally connected workforce? I'm looking at the spectrum of engineering. Engineers, engineering technologists, and engineering technicians. And how do we develop a shared understanding among countries? And I say that we develop that shared understanding by building bridges toward mutual recognition of the substantial equivalence of engineering education. We build bridges. And now, I'm going to make an analogy, and I apologize to my civil engineering colleagues in the audience. Perhaps I'm an electrical engineer, but I'm going to make my analogy based on civil engineering structure. And Pete Williams, you can tell Jim Birch that I stole this from him graciously. First of all, building bridges. So I see a foggy bridge out on the horizon, and it's just a bridge, and I want to make some connection between the two of us. Now, in civil engineering, I just took a couple of fundamental basics of the bridge building technique. You have the slope of the bridge, you have a span, and you have abutments. Now, I'm going to relate this to mutual recognition agreements. For example, building bridges really is the role of international agreements, mutual recognition agreements. The abutments are the national systems of quality assurance. They are the things on which this rests. The span represents the scope and capacity of the operation. And finally, the slope. At what level is the national system? And as you go see this, I'll show you how this works out. Let's look at the buttons, for example. The national systems of quality review and quality assurance. They don't have to be the same, but they must be capable of having their processes, policies, procedures, and standards compared and measured. They don't have to be the same. So we're not talking about this homogeneous system of education across the world. But let's look at the span, for example. The span, in my definition, is the framework which defines the mode and the scope of operation of a particular national quality assurance system. It contains things like its membership criteria, quality assurance monitoring and verification, appeals, compliances, peer review, voluntary, non-governmental fundamental principles of making up the span. The slope, well, the slope, it is very unlikely that the national systems will be at exactly the same level. So we don't expect that. But we have to ask certain questions. Are the national systems capable of delivering what is claimed to deliver? Is the delivered product close enough that we can establish substantial equivalency? We must be able to make judgments on what is an acceptable difference. Acceptable differences. That's accepting differences in systems. So, after you have the span, the abutments, and the rest of the bridge pieces put together, you have a structure for establishing a mutual recognition agreement. But you just don't walk away from that particular structure that you created. You must be maintained, must be repaired, and must be upgraded, just as a bridge on a highway. So these structures have evolved over the years, and I'm going to use a model which is called the Washington Accord, which I introduced last night. But let me expand the Washington Accord just a little bit. The Washington Accord is a mutual recognition agreement that deals with engineering. There's a similar accord that deals with engineering technologists, and that's called the Sydney Accord. There's a similar accord that deals with engineering technicians, and that's called the Dublin Accord. And they are similar, and they have particularly the same meaning as the Washington Accord does. The Washington Accord, in its fundamental basis, recognizes the substantial equivalency of accreditation systems to assess that graduates of accredited programs are prepared to enter practice at the entry level to the profession. In other words, we recognize each other's graduates as being prepared to enter the profession. This has the potential to promote and facilitate mobility of the engineering profession. Now, by virtue of the fact that the Washington Accord's affirmation of substantial equivalency among its members, the signatories have come to acknowledge generally accepted, globally relevant attributes that graduates from accredited engineering programs are expected to possess. This is a very broad statement. This acknowledgement of the substantial equivalence has the potential for facilitating mobility of practicing engineers across country boundaries and also within country boundaries. South America and Latin America, called Engineering for the Americas, they plan to form a coalition and join the Washington Accord. So does Mexico here and India in this area. So when those are completed, it looks to me like we will have a very, very strong mutual recognition agreement among countries, and now our job will be to maintain the structure and robustness of these mutual recognition agreements. How do we do it now? We maintain this bridge abutment, this structure, by routinely observing each other's processes. We routinely go out and visit each other in teams, and we accredit each other. And that's a very, very, I think, powerful on-site inspection of each signatory to each one of the accords. There's a mandatory review of each signatory at regular intervals. At the present time, it's at least every 6 years. Every 2 years, we have a general meeting of the Washington Accord signatories. The next meeting will be in 2007. The Washington Accord has become so busy now that we're having interim meetings in the years when we don't meet as a full body. And we meet in off years to work on particular items that are of interest to the Accord in enhancing engineering education, engineering technicians, and engineering technology. The last one that we had was this past June in 2006 in Dublin. There's upgrading that we have to do to maintain these structures. Questions. Should we consider increasing the scope of the agreement? And what I mean by that, should the Accords now go to look toward computing professionals as a part of the technology education? We have to look at the provisions that we make for the introduction of new members. And to upgrade it, we have to worry about improving the operations of the Accord. And I mean specifically there that the Secretary of the Washington Accord has been a voluntary position held by one of the signatories to the Accord, a voluntary position. This last year, the last time we met in 2005, we agreed that we would try to develop a permanent secretariat, a paid, funded secretariat, maintain the business of the Washington Accord. Now let me go to benchmarking, because I think this is very important. Somebody asked the question, what's it good for? Well, the Accord's good because it is nations getting together, sharing best practices and lessons learned, and how to enhance quality assurance of engineering education. And when I say that, I mean the full spectrum, from engineering technologists to technicians. And benchmarking is a very interesting concept that we weren't thinking about when we first started the Accord. In 1999, my organization, ABET, introduced to the Washington Accord the new approach to accreditation, which we call outcomes-based. It was called the Engineering Criteria 2000, in which we focused more on what students learned than what students were being taught in the particular classroom. We went to an outcomes-based approach. We introduced that concept in 1999 in South Africa, and the other countries were in some various forms of outcomes-based assessment. Well, the next time we met in 2001, we were well along the way in introducing outcomes assessment. So we stopped and said, wait, let's start to compare our criteria, our program outcomes, our objectives, and let's see how common we are. Let's see if there's a common core, some common strength among all of us that we can consider generally accepted attributes of these particular graduates. And so I talk about benchmarking. Now, the result of that whole exercise was completed about a year ago. And we introduced the concept, the graduate attributes and professional competency profiles for the engineer, engineering technologist, and engineering technician introduced in Rio last month. And you notice here, it goes beyond education to go and address also the professional competency profile for the professional practicing in the field. So I leave this up and I say, look at the website. It's www.asee.org, and go pull the paper down. But let me show you some parts of this particular graduate attributes that we came up with that were common among the accords. For example, there were 13 listed, 13 outcomes that were specifically identified in the accords that were common to all of us. And we said this core represents generally recognized and accepted attributes of the engineer. And I highlighted a couple here that I want to go into more detail. But it runs from academic education to knowledge of engineering sciences, through modern tool usage, through ethics, through lifelong learning. So let me talk about three of those. And these are academic education, modern tools, and ethics. But first, before doing that, I have to talk about the engineer and the range of problem solving. Because this differentiates the engineer's work from the engineering technologist and the engineering technician. The range of problem solving involves 9 different areas, and you can see those on your overhead there. Let me take a look at 2 of those. 2 of those, and the 2 that I've chosen, are the depth of analysis required and the depth of knowledge required. So look at how we define this. It's defined in terms of complex problems, broadly defined problems, and well-defined problems. Now, the engineer addresses complex problems. The technologist addresses broadly defined problems. The technician addresses well-defined problems. And here you see the definitions that we agreed upon that would that differentiate the engineer from the technician. So we talk about the depth of analysis. And let's look at the knowledge area. In the area of complex problems, it requires in-depth knowledge that allows a fundamentals-based, first-principle analytic approach. That's the engineer. For the technologist, it requires knowledge of principles and applied procedures and methodologies. Methodologies that have been worked out, procedures that have been worked out. And finally, the technician uses simply problems that can be solved using limited theoretical knowledge, but normally requires extensive practical knowledge. These are codes and rules and handbooks for this kind of thing. So if you define the range of problem solving in those 9 areas that I talked about, let's take a look at some of the attributes that we agreed upon that were commonly and were generally accepted among the accords. Academic education being the first one. As you see here, the engineer, Washington Accord, engineering technologist, Sydney Accord, engineering technician, Dublin Accord. This is more quantitative than the rest of the requirements. As you can see, the engineer is generally described by one who has completed an accredited program of study typified by 4 years or more of post-secondary study. 4 years or more. And a technologist, 3 years or more. Technician, 2 years or more, plus the post-secondary study. Let's now go to something that is more differentiating. For example, the use of modern tools. And how is this distinguished and differentiated among the engineer, the engineering technologist, and the engineering technician? Well, the engineer is expected to create, select, and apply appropriate techniques, resources, and modern engineering tools, including prediction and modeling, to note the word complex engineering activities with an understanding of the limitations. So this is describing what the competency of the engineer should be in the area of modern tool usage. The technologist, on the other hand, is expected to, almost the same as the engineer, but to apply this particular concepts to broadly defined engineering activities. Broadly defined engineering activities. And finally, the engineering technician applies techniques, resources, and modern engineering tools to well-defined engineering activities with an awareness of the limitations. So you see the differentiating characteristics is in the type of problems in which the tools are being selected. So that's one area of the attributes that we took a look at. And the final one I looked at is called ethics. And obviously, there is no difference, no distinguishing characteristic, and there should not be any distinguishing characteristic among the engineer, the technician, or the technologist as regards the area of ethics. Now, as I said to you earlier, that full paper with all of those attributes are on that website, and you can pull it down and take a look at it and go into much more detail. But let me end by a quote from a colleague in the UK, and it said, he was very profound, and you must tell him this, Pete, when you go back. I wrote this down. The Washington Accord is not a perfect marriage. It's a structure built out of what was available. Over the years, it has been subject to various stresses, but the original design has proved to be robust and capable of having a bit of bracing tacked on when necessary. Further modifications can be made and are under active discussion with the aim of making engineers globally recognized. In other words, what Jim is saying in the definition of his profound statement about the Washington Accord is that it is a dynamic agreement. It is not something that we sit down today and say, this is what we're going to do. We have to maintain it. We have to repair it. We have to upgrade it. We have to continually keep this thing moving in a dynamic way. Just as you have to maintain, upgrade, and repair a bridge. These kind of recognition agreements require work. They simply require work. And what's it good for? Well, I'll tell you. I think that belonging in one of these accords, these operations, allows the engineering community, or the people who assure quality in the engineering community, the opportunity to sit down and share, just commonly open share the problems and complexities that we're facing in our individual countries. And you can't imagine that at the conclusion of these meetings, how many ideas and thoughts are taken back home and actually implemented. That is the value. Now, in a practical manner, there's another, perhaps, consequence that was not even foreseen in the early development of the Accords, and that is the facilitation of the mobility of the professional. And I don't have time to go into this now, but you talk about the APEC engineer and the EMF. These all are based on the education being equivalent. Once the education is equivalent, then you can move to the next step of making equivalence of the engineering professional. That is, an engineer allowed to practice in any one of the signatory countries. Also, it allows for the free exchange of students. One now has not maybe to worry about whether if I send my student over to study in your school, in your country, and they take these particular courses, I'm assured now that if that program is accredited, I have some assurance that those outcomes are going to be similar to the outcomes that I would administer in my own institution. That's what it's good for. And so I leave this comment with you, and I pass it to my friend, because now what we're looking at is the upgrade and the movement of AB into the Washington Accord. So thank you very much, and I hope I didn't overrun my time. Well,
예, 저희가 지금 뭐 두 분이 평가와 인증 이런 거에 대해서 말씀해 주셨는데, 저희 이제 한국에서는 어떻게 하고 있나를 한번 말씀드리겠습니다. 저희 AB라는 곳의 모토가 Empowerment Engineering Education for Globally Competitive Engineers라고 해서고요. 그러니까 우리 엔지니어가 우리 졸업생들이 글로벌리 컴피티티브한 능력을 갖출 수 있도록 엔지니어링 에듀케이션을 잘 시키자라는 것이 저희 희망이고 목표입니다. 제가 오늘 말씀드릴 것은 6가지 정도를 말씀드릴 텐데 시간이 좀 빨리 진행됐습니다. 사실 제가 이 말로 시작하는 것은 좀 주제넘는다고 생각하는데, 왜 에듀케이션에 이밸류에이션이 필요하느냐? 사실은 저는 크게 두 가지가 필요하다고 생각했습니다. 뭐냐면 우리 에듀케이션 프로그램이 Continuous Quality Improvement CQI가 달성이 돼야 될 것이다. 이것이 과연 되고 있나를 체크해야 되고, 또 하나는 각 졸업생 하나하나가 우리가 그 졸업생이 충분히 자격을 갖추고 나갈 수 있는가, 또 이것이 올해보다 내년 학생들이 더 좋은 학생들이 나갈 수 있는가를 증명할 수 있는가. 그래서 이걸 간단히 그냥 정리하면 프로그램과 졸업생에 대한 퀄리티 어슈런스 때문에 필요하다라고 감히 생각해 보는데, 이거 이외에 한 가지 더 이유가 생겼습니다. 그래서 졸업생들이 이 글로벌화이즈 되고 모빌리티가 필요하면 이제 글로벌리 서로 상호 레코그니션이 필요하더라고요. 그래서 글로벌 레코그니션이 이 에듀케이션을 이밸류에이션 해야 되는 굉장히 중요한 이유가 되고 있다라고 생각합니다. 그러니까 이 글로벌 레코그니션이 없다면 굳이 인정을 안 받아도 되지 않을까라는 생각을 할 정도고요. 사실 우리나라에서의 휴먼 리소스가 얼마나 중요한 거는 지금까지 계속 이틀 동안 많이 들으셨기 때문에 별로 크게 중요하지 않지만, 사실은 이 세 번째 제가 말씀하신 엔지니어의 잡이 바뀌고 있다. 단순히 기술이나 기능을 다루는 게 아니라 많은 엔지니어가 이제는 CEO도 되고 리서처도 되고 디시전 메이커가 되다 보니까 당연히 이 사람들의 잡도 다르고, 또 엔지니어들도 자기들의 그 목표가 디자이너나 고울이 바뀌었다고 생각합니다. 그러면 당연히 뭐가 바뀌어야 되냐면 학교에서의 교육이 바뀌어야 된다고 생각합니다. 그래서 그리고 또 엔지니어링 프로그램은 당연히 그들의 그 컨스티튜언트의 요구를 반영해야 되고, 또한 이 모빌리티가 굉장히 이제 우리나라도 선진국화되고 OECD 가맹국이 되고, 이제 우리나라 많은 기업들이 다른 나라의 사람들을 뽑고 우리나라 학생들이 다른 세계 다른 기업으로 취직을 하고 하다 보니까 이 모빌리티라는 엔지니어들의 모빌리티라는 것이 굉장히 중요하게 되는데, 이 엔지니어 모빌리티가 중요하게 되면 당연히 제가 말씀드린 것처럼 퀄리티 어슈런스, 그 다음에 뮤추얼 레코그니션이 필요하다는 거죠. 모빌리티가 필요하면. 그런데 이미 엔지니어링 에듀케이션에 대한 스탠다드가 이미 존재하고 있습니다. 이제 우리가 새롭게 만들 필요가 없고, 존재하는데 이게 워싱턴 어코드라는 거죠. 워싱턴 어코드가 이미 존재하고 있기 때문에 우리가 스탠다드를 새로 만들 필요한 게 아니라 이걸 따라야 한다는 것이 저희의 그 잡이라고 생각합니다. 그러면 다시 한번 이제 보다 근본적인 질문이 평가라든지 이 교육을 평가한다는 평가가 어떻게 되어야 되겠냐? 우리 교육 평가는 이벤트성이 돼서 일회적으로 한번 하고 마는 이벤트성이 되어서는 안 되겠다는 생각이고요. 그 다음에 인터널 해가지고는 공정성이나 객관성이 없어서 엑스터널 해야 될 것 같고, 그 다음에 이 평가를 통해서 학생과 프로그램이 둘 다 베네피셜 해야지 뭐 어디에서 하는 것처럼 망신이나 주는 그런 그 평가가 돼서는 안 되지 않느냐. 그 다음에 모든 디서플린, 모든 영역을 커버를 해야 되겠다. 그래서 이것을 저희는 이밸류에이션 단순 평가보다는 어프레디테이션이라는 게 필요하지 않나라고 생각하고요. 그래서 지금 우리가 ABIC이 갖고 있는 종종 말씀드리는 얘기가 뭐냐면, 우리는 ABIC은 피리어딕, 주기적으로 학교의 컨티뉴어스 퀄리티 임프루먼트를 위해서 외부적으로 외부 기관이 평가한다는 것을 이 앞에 말씀드린 네 가지 것을 만족하기 위해서 종종 이런 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 그 다음에 우리 그래서 ABIC은 어떤 기준을 갖고 있냐면 Knowledge Information Based Society, 그러니까 우리 지식정보화 사회에서의 그 엔지니어가 자체할 모든 어빌리티, 아까 좀 전에 우리 피터슨 총장께서 어트리뷰트라고 말씀한 13가지 워싱턴 어코드의 엔지니어가 갖춰야 할 13가지 자질이라고 어트리뷰트라고 해놓은 건데, 그 13가지 어트리뷰트를 전부 다 만족시켜야 되겠다라는 것을 갖고 있고요. 그 다음에 이게 아웃컴 베이스 크라이테리아야 된다. 인풋 베이스가 아니라. 그래서 우리 총장님께서 이미 말씀하신 교수가 뭐를 가르쳤나 보다 학생들이 뭐를 배웠는지를 매너블리 우리가 측정할 수 있는 그런 것을 해야 되겠다. 그리고요. 그 다음에 우리 졸업생이 프로페셔널 엔지니어의 엔트리 레벨이 되는 것을 개런티해야겠다. 그리고 프로그램은 또 CQI를 이루어져야겠다. 이것이 제 생각에는 우리 AB의 어크레디테이션입니다. 인풋 베이스하고 아웃풋 베이스 크라이테리아가 조금 달라서요. 제가 한번 그냥 간단히 말씀드리면 인풋 베이스 크라이테리아는 보통 빈 카운티라고 할 때 콩신다고 얘기하는데요. 만일에 어떤 골퍼가 자기 채널은 홈마 호스트하고 옷은 디자이너 셔츠 입고 신발은 바리 신고 골프공은 타이탈리스 쓴다고 이 사람 잘 칩니까? 이것들이 잘 되어 있다는 것은 사실 인풋 베이스입니다. 인풋 베이스로 이런 게 잘 되어 있으면 이 사람이 잘 칠 것이라고 생각하는 게 인풋 베이스 크라이테리아라면 실제로 아웃풋 베이스는 굉장히 간단해요. 스코어를 봐요. 스코어. 이게 그냥 아웃풋 베이스. 스코어가 좋은 휴지 굿이에요. 사실 인풋 베이스와 아웃풋 베이스는 굉장히 심플하게 디퍼런스있고요. 이거를 조금 더 우리가 엔지니어 타입으로 얘기를 한다면 사실 아시다시피 이런 프로그램 라인이 있어가지고 우리 공장 라인에서 쭉 집어넣어서 이런 기아를 만드는데 이 기아를 만들 때 우리가 뭐 인풋 파트나 재질이 어떤 거 좋은 걸 썼느냐 그 다음에 우리 대학교 나온 네모 노동자들 다 대학교 나오나 그 다음에 매니 시스템이 뭐 좋다 에피션시 좋다 이게 이 기아에 무슨 의미가 있는 거죠. 실은 아웃 베이스 크라이테리아라면 당연히 이걸 통해서 만든 재질의 디멘전 애큐러시는 얼마나 있나 하드니스는 얼마냐 얼티메이트 텐사일 스트렝스는 얼마냐 엘롱게이션은 얼마냐 이것이 중요한 것이지 실제로 내가 인풋으로 무엇을 갖췄느냐는 의미가 없지 않느냐. 사실 이제는 모든 공장 라인에서 인풋 베이스로 하는 건 별로 없습니다. 그러면 이 졸업생 이 경우에는 어떻게 하냐? 사실 이 졸업생이 인풋 베이스 크라이테리아는 어떤 커리큘럼을 가지느냐, 프로페서는 누구한테 배우냐, 퍼실리티는 어떠냐, 그 다음에 100년 된 전통이냐, 50년 된 전통이냐. 이게 이 졸업생을 특질을, 어트리뷰트를 하는데 별로 도움이 안 되고 아웃풋 베이스라면 당연히 이 친구는 전공 실력이 얼마나 되냐, 디자인 익스피리언스는 있느냐, 매스 앤 베이직 사이언스 또는 컴퓨터에 대한 이해력은 얼마나 있는가, 또 우리가 소위 말하는 소프트 스킬이라는 커뮤니케이션 스킬이라든가 라이프롱 러닝 어빌리티나 에틱스나 이런 거에 대한 것들이 얼마나 있느냐 이거를 측정을 해서 내보내자는 게 아웃풋 베이스드 크라이테리아고 이것을 가능하게 하는 것은 아까 제가 좀 전에 인풋 베이스드 크라이테리아는 종종 이벨리에이션을 어떤 타입으로 하냐면 빈 카운팅으로 한다는 게 그렇습니까? 얘가 얼마나 갖고 있느냐. 근데 지금 이거는 이런 것들을 측정하기 위해서는 소위 말해서 피어 리뷰가 필요합니다. 훈련받은 이벨리에이터가 피어 리뷰를 통해서만이 이런 것들을 측정할 수 있고 그런 것이 진정으로 프로그램을 CQI와 학생들의 그 자질의 향상을 도울 수 있다고 생각합니다. 그래서 AB는 누구냐 하면 AB의 비전과 이것을 먼저 말씀드리겠습니다. 저희 로고가 Accreditation Board for Engineering Education Korea라는 거고요. 밑에 있는 로고가 저희 로고고요. AB는 NGO고 이게 말이 많습니다만 일단 제일 중요한 게 우리나라에서 공학 분야에서 only recognized accreditation body고요. 그 다음에 우리가 지금 2005년에 US 달러 160만 불 정도 됐는데 지금 버짓이 올해는 200만 불이 넘을 정도로 예산도 굉장히 커지고 있고요. 현재 우리가 accreditation 프로그램이 얼마냐면 19 different니까 19개 유니버시티에서 지금 현재 62개 프로그램을 업그레이드 했고 69개 프로그램이 업그레이드 비짓을 했습니다. 그래서 총 19개 유니버시티에서 이 정도의 업그레이드를 했고요. 지금 현재 올해 4개의 유니버시티에 60개 프로그램을 지금 심사 중입니다. 그것과 그 내셔널 아카데미 같은 이런 그 엔지니어링 코리아 이런 기관, 프로페셔널 엔지니어링 소사이티 이런 세 군데서 같이 서포트하고 있고요. 제일 중요한 기구가 저희라는 게 코리안 프로페셔널 엔지니어링 어소시에이션, 이 기술사협회입니다. 한국 기술사협회와 또 휴먼 리소스 디벨롭먼트 코리아가 저희 그걸 기구로 했는데, 이 두 기구를 제가 강조드리는 이유는 우리는 엔지니어를 교육시키지만 프로페셔널 이 기구는 레지스터 기구고요. 이 기구는 라이센싱 기구입니다. 엔지니어라고 자격증을 지르는 기구가 여기 우리 산업인력공단이고요. 그 된 기술사를 레지스터하는 데가 한국 기술사 협회이기 때문에 이 두 기구가 협조하에 물론 프로페셔널 소사이티 전문 기구와 정부 기구도 들어와 있지만 이런 식으로 해서 우리가 구성되어 있고요. 저희 그 구조를 보면 보드 오브 디렉터가 있고요. 프레지던트, 저희 프레지던트 지금 박찬모 원장님한테 계시고요. 바이스 프레지던트, 그 다음에 6개 집행기구가 있습니다. 저희는 총 175개 멤버가 있고 그 중에서 143개가 인더스트리 멤버가 있고요. 24개가 프로페셔널 소사이어티고 8개가 가버먼트와 릴레이티드 인스티튜트입니다. 저희 보드 오브 디렉터는 취업에는 삼성전자의 윤종용 부회장님이시고요. 저희 원장님은 박찬모 원장님이십니다. 그 다음에 저희가 보드 멤버가 학회에서는 11개 학회가 당연직으로 들어오고요. 그 다음에 산업체에서 5개 대기업이 산업체 대표로 이사회에 참석하고 있습니다. 그 다음에 그 외에 제가 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 HRDK라든가 KPE나 기술사협회라든가 아니면 우리 정부의 4 부처의 차관님들부터 해서 8개 레프레젠터티브가 관여해서 총 30분 정도가 저희 이사회입니다. 저희 비전을 먼저 말씀드리면 ABIC은 인증과 컨설팅을 통해서 학교들의 공학교육을 좀 이노베이션하고 좀 잘하게 가르치고 그 다음에 그걸 통해서 글로벌 스탠더드에 퀄리파이 하겠다라는 것이 저희 비전이고요. 이걸 달성하기 위해서 미션을 보면 여러 가지, 저희가 지금 7가지 미션이 있는데 중요한 게 인증받은 프로그램을 다른 그렇지 않은 프로그램과 구별하고 그 다음에 퀄리티 임프루먼트 각 기관, 각 교육기구가 CQI가 이루도록 퀄리티 임프루먼트가 될 수 있도록 할 것이고 그 다음에 우리가 또 평가뿐 아니라 어드바이저리 기능도 할 것이고 하겠다는 것이고요. 저희가 인증활동에서의 큰 오브젝티브는 크게 4가지 있지만 인증활동의 큰 오브젝티브는 프랙티컬 엔지니어링, 그러니까 실질적으로 그 분야의 학생들이 할 수 있는 것이 업그레이드 프로그램은 이제 준비가 되어 있다. 업그레이드 프로그램의 졸업생은 그 프로페셔널 엔지니어링 비즈니스를 하기 위한 준비가 되어 있다는 것을 개런티하기 위한 것이 저희 인증활동의 목적이고요. 그 외에 나머지 목적도 있고요. 그 또 중요한 피처 중에 하나가 저희가 아웃컴 베이스 에듀케이션을 갖고 있다라고 말씀드리고 있습니다. 저희 인증 기준은 7가지가 있고요. 지금 보시면 알겠지만 학생부터 시작해서 여기 패컬티도 있고 퍼실리티도 있고 프로그램 아웃컴도 다 있는데 어떻게 보면 이제까지의 기존의 다른 제가 좀 전에 비교드린 인풋 베이스 크라이테리아랑 뭐가 다르냐 하면 다른 거 없습니다. 기준은 항목은 똑같지만 이 항목을 구성하고 있는 것과 이것들을 평가하는 방식이 다르다는 뜻입니다. 단순히 예를 들어서 패컬티가 얼마나 논문을 많이 쓴 패컬티가 있고 얼마나 많은 퍼실리티가 있냐가 중요한 게 아니라 결국 그것이 교육과 어떻게 연관되어 있고 교육에 얼마나 필요한 만큼 훌륭한 업그레이드 프로그램으로서 교육을 할 수 있을 만큼의 교수님과 퍼실리티가 준비되어 있나를 보겠다는 그런 거기 때문에 실제로 항목은 똑같더라도 내용이 다르다라고 이해해 주시면 고맙겠습니다. 이거는 제가 그냥 넘어가겠습니다. 저희가 우리와 미국과 일본의 경우에 Math and Science, 그 다음에 Major, 그 다음에 General Education의 파트를 하는데 저희가 굉장히 컴패러티브 하다고 말씀드리고요. 저희 프로시저를 보면 상당히 긴 프로시저를 갖고 있습니다. 신청서부터 최종 결정까지 총 1년 반 정도 되는 프로시저를 갖고 있는데 이 1년 반 정도 되는 오래된 프로시저를 갖는 이유가 뭐냐면 피어 리뷰고 굉장히 단순 평가가 아니라 컨설팅 기능과 함께 주고받고 의견 교환을 필요로 하는데 제가 조금 더 간단히 좀 설명드리면 저희가 박본 사이트 비즈로부터 EAC 최종 판정까지 사실은 세 단계의 컨시스턴스 커미티를 합니다. 저희가 피어 리뷰의 단점이 뭐냐면 한두 명의 평가자가 오도된 편견된 의사로 결정을 내릴 수가 있어서 그런 것을 방지하기 위해서 세 단계 컨시스턴스 커미티가 있습니다. 그리고 한 단계의 에디팅 프로세스가 있고요. 이런 단계를 거쳐서 컨시스턴스를 유지하기 위해서 굉장히 오래 합니다. 그래서 조금 더, 그래서 5월 달에 언사이트 비즈가 끝났지만 최종 EAC 결정은 11월 말에 발생할 정도로 상당히 많은 컨시스턴시 커미티를 열고 그 다음에 학교들과 컨설팅에서 주고받는 작업을 거치고 있습니다. 그래서 현재 지금 올해 인증하는 것이 여기 드래프트 프리리미너리 스테이트먼트가 나가 있는 상태인데 이거는 지금 우리의 파트 오브 디시전이고 아직까지 충분히 더 학교와 의견 교환을 해서 인증 결과가 나올 거라고 생각합니다. 지난 6년 동안 AB이 1999년에 창설이 돼서 올해는 사실은 횟수로는 7년째고 만으로는 6년이 지났는데 뭘 했냐고는 저는 그냥 간단히 얘기하면 우리 그래도 머추어됐고 성숙됐고 사실 국제적으로 레코그니션이 이루어지고 있다라고 말씀드리면요. 저희 성숙의 지표를 보면 저희가 인증 방문한 프로그램까지를 포함해서 인증한 대학교가 상당히 늘어나는 거예요. 그 다음에 프로그램 수가 현재 올해 140개 프로그램을 인증 방문을 했고 누적 방문 수로는 저희가 200개에 가까울 정도로 지금 프로그램 수가 굉장히 늘어나고 굉장히 스티프하게 프로그램 수가 늘어나고 있습니다. 그 다음에 이베리에이터, 평가자가 사실 저희 이 아웃컴 베이스 크라이테리아의 중요한 점은 훈련받은 좋은 이베리에이터가 있어야 된다라는 건데 이베리에이터의 트레이닝을 저희가 보통 이틀에 걸쳐서 하루는 평가자 교육, 그 다음은 좀 길어서 평가위원 교육을 해서 최소한 이틀간의 풀데이 교육을 받아야 이베리에이터로 나가는데 이베리에이터 훈련받은 이베리에이터가 2006년 현재 1000명이 넘었고요. 저희가 2009년까지는 3000명 선을 가질 수 있도록 이베리에이팅 프로그램을 돌리고 있고 평가자 교육을 하고 있습니다. 저희 인증 결과를 지금 한번 보시면 저희가 외국분들이 있어서 제가 이렇게 보는데 서울 수도권에 우리나라가 대략 한 2,500만이 있고 그 다음에 수도권 이외의 지역에 2,200만 정도의 인구가 있다면 사실 학교는 수도권에 약 40개 그 다음에 수도권 아닌데 한 60% 정도 이렇게 나눠져 있고 수도권에 있는 대학들이 잘 아시다시피 서울내셔널 유니버시티에서 고려대학교, 연세대학교, 한양대학교 이런 식으로 있고요. 지방에 있는 대학들이 이렇게 많습니다. 근데 보면 아시겠지만 서울대학교, 고려대학교, 연세대학교, 한양대학교, 성균관대학교, 인하대학교, 강원대학교는 여기 써 있는 대학들 전부 다 최소한 어크레디테이션 비짓 또는 어크레디티드 프로그램을 이미 인증을 한 번이라도 받은 대학들이고요. 지방에 있는 학교도 부산, 경북 요 두 대학교는 지금 인증을 받은 대학교고요. 울산대학교, 영남대학교 인증을 받은 대학교입니다. 저희가 그냥 과감히 제가 이제 메이저 유니버시티라고 한국에서의 메이저 유니버시티로 썼으면 퍼블릭 유니버시티로는 서울내셔널 그러니까 학생 수 많은 걸로 그냥 했습니다. 서울대학교, 부산대학교, 경북대학교, 전남대학교, 충남대학교, 전남대학교, 카이스트가 퍼블릭 유니버시티로 탑이라면 이 중에서 이미 3군데가 받았고 프라이빗 유니버시티로는 사실 100개가 넘는 프라이빗 유니버시티인데 그 중에서 우리 원장님이신 포스트가 좀 준비신이고요. 그 나머지 메이저 유니버시티들은 다 인증을 받았다고 생각해서 저희는 한국에서는 이미 인증이 대세로 메인스트림으로 자리 잡지 않았다라고 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 그리고 이제 종종 저희가 외국 사람들에게 너네들 도대체 인증을 어디서 배웠니? 라는 말씀을 많이 하는데 저희가 인증을 어디서 배웠냐면 주 벤치마킹 대상은 미국 ABET이었습니다. ABET으로부터 크라이테리아 기준 인증 절차, 이벨리티 트레이닝 방법 이런 것들을 거의 다 미국 ABS에서 배웠습니다. 예를 들어서 저희가 2002년부터 올해까지 5차례에 걸쳐서 ABS에서 개최하고 있는 워크샵, 서밋 커미션, 애뉴얼 미팅에 참석하고 있고요. 로스어만에서 열리고 있는 프로그램 아웃컴스 앤 어세스먼트 워크숍을 2003년 이래 계속 지금 참가하고 있고요. 그 다음에 미국의 어프레디션 BGC라고 그러니까 인증 활동을 저희가 2005년, 2006년 2년째 참가하고 있습니다. 그 다음에 ASE 미팅을 2003년 이래 참가하고 있고 올해는 EAC와 CAC 미팅 이게 마지막 결정 회의인데요. 미국에서 이거를 올해 참가했습니다. 그 다음에 그 인증 다른 나라의 워싱턴 오코드 가맹 회원국의 인증 활동을 저희가 영국, 일본, 아일랜드, 남아공을 2005년에 다 참가를 해봤고요. 그 다음에 미국의 CAC와 같은 EAC 미팅을 하는 것이 캐나다에는 CEAB 미팅인데 이 CEAB 미팅을 작년과 올해 참가하고 있고 그 다음에 일본에서는 일본 CEAB 미팅도 2005년 주년을 참가하고 있습니다. 그래서 워싱턴 오코드 가맹 회원국들의 인증 활동을 잘 모니터링하고 있고 벤치마킹하고 있고 거기서부터 우리가 인증을 배웠다라고 말씀드리고 있습니다. 또 구체적으로 우리의 인증 활동을 저쪽에다 보여드리고 있습니다. 제가 좀 빨리 하겠습니다. 예. 그래서 보시면 알겠지만 3번에 걸쳐서 3년에 걸쳐서 거의 전 워싱턴 오코드 가맹 회원국들을 다 한 차례 이상씩 초청해서 저희 인증 활동을 보여주고 카멘트를 받고 그래서 저희가 좀 고쳤습니다. 뮤추얼 리커버리션 파트를 보면 저희 보시면 알겠지만 우리나라는 이미 엔지니어 자격증 갖고 있는 사람들의 모빌리티는 APEC 엔지니어 협약을 96년에 체결하였고요. EMF 엔지니어 협약을 2000년에 들어가서 이미 이 두 엔지니어링 모빌리티 기구의 정형입니다. 그런데도 불구하고 아카데믹 스탠다드를 맞추고 있는 아카데믹 스탠드가 되어야 해요. 워싱턴 오코드는 아직 이제 겨우 2005년에 준회원이 되었을 뿐입니다. 이제 겨우 프로페셔널 멤버가 됐는데 앞으로 빨리 이거를 거쳐야 진정한 의미의 모빌리티를 갖췄다고 생각할 수 있습니다. 뮤추얼 리커버리션은 이제 이렇게 계속 많이 하고 있다는 거고요. 그래서 2003년에 11월 달에 ABEC 패컬티를 모아서 한번 했는데 여기 우리 조지 피터슨 닥터 조지 피터슨 여기 있고 글로리아 로저스나 댄 엘드리치 교수님들 4분 초청해서 제가 브로드에서 강의를 가졌고요. 그 다음에 이거는 이제 2004년에 저희가 워싱턴 오코드 회원국들을 초청해서 오브저베이션을 받은 거고 2005년에 5개 나라로부터 왔고 올해는 2006년에는 6개 나라로부터 7명의 오브저버가 와서 저희 인증 활동을 참관했습니다. 오늘 저희가 올해 6월달에 있었던 아일랜드의 워크숍에 참여했던 것입니다. 그러면 우리는 우리나라 사회의 엔지니어링 커뮤니티에 뭐를 요청하냐 하면 사실 엔지니어링 커뮤니티 코리아가 인더스트리, 프로페셔널 소사이어티, 가버먼트 앤 릴레이티드 인스티튜트, 유니버시티 하고 이렇게 전부 다 우리 같이 엔지니어를 교육하고 엔지니어를 사용하는 사람들이라면 이분들이 각자 우리는 사실 ABEC은 이런 활동들을 잘 하겠습니다. 학생들을 퀄리티 어슈런스 할 뿐 아니라 우리 학생들이 21세기에 알맞는 프로페셔널 나이리지와 소프트 스킬을 갖추고 있는 것을 개런티하도록 준비하겠습니다. 하지만 인더스트리 쪽에서는 당연히 보내주셨다면 이 엔지니어링 에듀케이션을 서포트 해주시고 그 다음에 중요한 게 업그레이션 액티비티에 참여해 주시고 그 다음에 그들이 인더스트리의 오피니언을 반드시 저희한테 주셔야 됩니다. 단순히 컴플레인만 하지 마시고 인더스트리는 어떻게 교육을 시켜야 된다는 것을 적극적으로 주셨으면 하고요. 다음 굉장히 중요한 파트가 이렇게 교육받은 학생들에 대한 충분한 베네핏이 있어야 됩니다. 예를 들어서 삼성전자에서 신입사원을 뽑을 때 업그레이드 프로그램에서 10%의 가산점을 주기로 했습니다. 이런 인증 프로그램 졸업자들한테 충분한 실질적인 베네핏이 있어야 교수님들은 열심히 애들을 가르치고 그렇게 가르친 학생들은 굉장히 더 많은 공부를 하고 더 많은 스킬을 저희가 히터스 안에 이용하는 거고요. 프로페셔널 소사이어티는 사실은 프로페셔널 소사이어티가 전문 학회들이 공학교육을 등한시했던 것 같아요. 그러니까 공학교육의 학회의 참여가 굉장히 적었는데 학회들도 이제 기계공학회니 금속공학회니 있는 학회들이 공학교육이 어떻게 돼야 할지 여러 가지 툴을 만들어 주시고 교수법을 만들어 주시고 그 다음에 많은 그러니까 이런 우리 프로페셔널 에어리아에 대한 이노베이션에 대한 에듀케이션에 대한 방법을 제공해 주시는 게 프로페셔널의 전문 학회에서의 책임인 것 같고요. 저는 사실 정부 쪽에서는 굉장히 중요한 거는 사실 어크레디션을 인증을 서포트 좀 해주시고 그 다음에 엔지니어링 에듀케이션에 대한 리서치를 또 서포트 해주셔야 되는 거죠. 엔지니어링 에듀케이션도 그러니까 우리가 엔지니어의 리서치와 마찬가지로 이것도 리서치한 대상이지 공학교육이 저절로 되는 게 아니라 공학교육의 방법론과 어세스먼트 툴과 이런 것들이 정부가 이것도 공대 교수가 리서치해야 할 분야라고 해서 인식해 주셔서 좀 이런 분야에도 연구비를 제공해 주셔야 되는 거고 그 다음에 인증받은 프로그램과 그 학생들이 분명한 베네핏을 줄 수 있도록 정부가 정책을 써주셨으면 하고요. 그 다음에 글로벌 모빌리티가 사실은 글로벌 모빌리티는 상호주의입니다. 우리 학생이 캐나다나 미국이나 영국에 나갈 거면 우리가 어디서 고대 들으면 그쪽에 있는 학생들도 우리에 들어와야 합니다. 이런 상호주의 원칙에 있어서 글로벌 모빌리티가 되려면 우리나라 규정들이 조금 고쳐야 될 게 많습니다. 그런 규정들에 대한 것도 적극적으로 좀 서포트 해주셔야 되겠다라는 생각을 했습니다. 예, 제가 시간을 좀 감사합니다.
외국분들이 통일이 아니신 것 같아서요. 하여간에 그 세 분의 말씀을 들어서 아시다시피 우리의 그 공학교육은 글로벌이 레코그나이즈드 그러니까 세계적으로 인정받는 그런 공학교육이 되게 되는 것을 다시는다. 그러기 위해서는 우리가 워싱턴 어코드 같은 세계 스탠다드, 세계 표준에 맞는 그러한 공학교육을 해야 되겠죠. 그래서 제가 바라기는 오늘의 이 세션을 통해서 우리의 앞으로의 공학교육의 방향 그런 걸 갖다가 좀 더 여러분들이 확실하게 알게 되고 그리고 우리가 길러내는 육성하는 공학자들이 세계적으로 인정받는 그러한 중학생이 되도록 우리가 다 노력하기를 바라면서 이것으로 이 세션을 마치겠습니다. 여러분 잘 간 시간 감사합니다.